Women of Wyoming Then and Now is brought to you by the Wyoming Historical Society and supported in part by a grant from the Wyoming Cultural Trust Fund, a program of the Department of State Parks and Cultural Resources. This program features unique female perspectives on events, themes, or narratives related to state history. We, the host, believe that one woman's action toward a better future can result in a greater legacy that inspires and equips many generations of women to come. Welcome! I am Janelle Maloney, today's host of Women of Wyoming Then and Now. With me today is my co-host Leslie Wagoner, an archivist at the American Heritage Center.
Thanks, Janelle, and I'm so happy to speak to Sara today. Just really excited about this interview.
Yes, I am also excited to introduce to you Sara Burlingame from Wyoming Equality.
Howdy, I'm Sara Burlingame, and I'm the Executive Director of Wyoming Equality. And I live here in the capital of Wyoming, Cheyenne, and it was my honor to serve House District 44 in the Wyoming legislature in the 2018-2019 legislative session.
Excellent. Well, we have done a little bit of extra research on you and your interest with representing minority demographics appropriately in past and present narratives. And so we think what you've been up to is very important and exciting for our viewers to hear about and to even look into further. But for our viewers, can you go ahead and introduce for us something you've done that will impact future perspectives on Wyoming history, especially for women?
Sure. One of the things that Wyoming Equality tries to ground our advocacy in is the sense of place and community that is Wyoming. And so, for instance, we've done a lot of work in the Wyoming State Archives and, tried to excavate the stories of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, two-spirited, especially since we have two enrolled tribes here, and just queer Wyomingites. That's something that we're really passionate about and that we've spent some time doing. And if you come to our office, you can see these pictures that represent that LGBTQ Wyomingites have always been a part of the state, even before we were a state.
You mentioned earlier that there's this idea of we've always been here. So where have you been? How do you know where these demographics have been? Where does that information come from?
Yeah, when you look at the history of Wyoming, sometimes we use as a guiding star this quote by the Black advocate W.E.B. Du Bois. And he said that the history of Black Americans was everything that was absent or distorted. So I think the same is true of any sort of, minoritized population where we weren't writing our own history. Our history was being subsumed under a larger narrative that either erased or distorted our participation. So one of the pictures that you'll see if you walk into our office is a picture of the USS Wyoming with a Wyoming sailor who is dressed in a beautiful gown and is there for the the ceremony, the Order of Neptune, as the ship fresh out of the harbor is crossing the equator for the first time. And so for some people, seeing naval history, seeing something that they're familiar with the USS Wyoming, they're familiar with military history, but they maybe aren't familiar with the role that LGBTQ Wyomingites played in that history. And so our goal is to not recreate something new, but to just sort of help people recognize that our participation has always been present. It just hasn't always been welcome and named out loud. That's really the problem. Everybody didn't mean everybody until it does. And I was about to say everybody doesn't mean everybody until it did, but I don't think I'm ready to say we've reached Zion. We're there. We have it. We don't all enjoy the same equal protections. And so that's why organizations like Wyoming Equality exist, is to help illuminate that and move us further into equality.
Well said.
As an archivist, I love that you are looking at the historical record. I just think that is so important to show, hey, this is not new. It's not new in Wyoming. It's not new anywhere. And I, someone like you who has been studying the history, what do you perceive was happening then that is the same thing? Is it still true today? Or do you notice many differences?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think sort of the seminal act that I always go back to, that I always think about as being so pivotal in Wyoming, and how it would look different if it happened today, is the first vote, right? Like when Wyoming becomes a territory that embraces suffrage, we know in South Pass that they ordered extra security, that they got people lined up in case there was violence, in case there was a riot. And we know that some of the very first women who voted were women of color. And I see that, like when I was at the university last week, and I saw these amazing young activists and advocates who, are women of color from Wyoming. They were born and raised here, and they're just doing great stuff. And I think the difference that I see between then and now is we'll know their names. Like they'll make sure we know their names, right? Like they're very clear. You will know my name. And the heartbreak for me, right, is that we don't know the names of those women, right? Like they weren't recorded. We recorded Louisa Swain's name. If you had that status, if you were white, if you owned property, if you had access to some of that power, then we'll know your name and we'll record it. But those women, like, where did they work? Did they work in a brothel? Did they work, in a laundry? Like, where could women work in South Pass? We don't know, right? I mean, we don't know their names. We know the name of Esther Hobart Morris, right? Who comes out of South Pass. But again, she had status, she had power, she had something that will make us remember her name. So between now and then, that's the difference that I see. I mean, we look for two-spirited folks that we can lift up, right? So that we can say, look, before we were a state, we were a territory. Before we were a territory, this was indigenous land. And so who are those indigenous leaders? Who are those two-spirited people? Because we know they exist from oral history, right? Like we have the stories. What were their names? Can I find a picture? And I just find it heartbreaking to have so much history go unnamed, absent, distorted.
I really like how you put that. And you remind me, so my background in history and my passion is studying Oregon Trail immigrants. And one of the things that I'm starting to see now when I read these trail diaries and I follow through with what happened to them, I see PTSD, which didn't exist, but I can now put it back into context and explore mental health issues that were not documented or not talked about. And I can see that these things were going on and people were struggling way back then. So I love how you're able to bridge that gap and bring the information that we know now into the appropriate context so we can see the whole picture. So thank you for doing that for the people that you're most passionate about. But I'm curious now how you got into that. Can you elaborate for us on the background or the context that really drew you in to pursuing that extra research, to pursue making the past align with the present?
Yeah, my mom, Patricia Burlingame, she is an amateur genealogist. And so when I was a kid, we grew up in the Intermountain West. We grew up in Nevada, Idaho, Wyoming, and California. And, back in the day, there was no internet, there was no family search or ancestry. There was the LDS church reading room, and you didn't have to be a member. You could go in and you could get these boxes of microfiche and you could sit there in the dark. And when I was a kid, I would have told you, I will chew glass before I ever go into an archive or a genealogy room. I thought it was the worst thing ever. So it's real surprising to everyone that I turned out to have that hankering for it, because I do think it is something similar to, like, when you get addicted to crossword puzzles or riddles or something, that there's something so profoundly satisfying about having a mystery and an open question, right? About what did people do before I was here? What did my ancestors lay the ground for? What was successful and what failed? And if you go back into the archives, if you go back and into our history, when you find that and you connect those pieces, I find it very satisfying. And everything, all roads lead back to that, same truth, which is we have always been here. There is nothing new under the sun. Like lesbian, gay, bisexual, two-spirit folks, like, we didn't pop up in the year 2000. We have always been here. And finding out what those stories are, sometimes it's so heartbreaking, right? Like, sometimes it's just crushing seeing people who look like me, who look like my community, just having no door that opens to them. Every avenue is a dead end. And then sometimes you see these ways that we have been so creative and found a way in the harshest of environments to create joy and beauty and community and family. And I find that very inspiring.
I'm curious, Wyoming Equality, how you specifically got involved with Wyoming Equality, and here you are now executive director.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. Again, I don't know that that's a path anybody else would have seen for me. Yeah, I mean, I think I organized my first demonstration when I was 15 years old. And I think the sort of seeds that would become the sort of advocacy that I was interested in were all in that first organization. I mean, I was 15 years old, and it was a reproductive rights rally. And I was a member of a women's literature book club that they had at this tiny little town that I went to high school in the Mojave Desert. And the adult women said, man, we would really like to participate in this, but the town is so small and it's so conservative. We think our jobs would be in trouble. We think our family relationships would be in trouble. So we can't do that. And so, I organized a small group of high school students to do this demonstration, in our town that was in favor of women's reproductive rights. And, the backlash from it was interesting to me. My dad says, years later, he told me when we were making the, posters for that demonstration in our garage, he came and he lowered the garage door because he was afraid of someone coming by with a gun. That's what he was afraid of. And so he was armed and he was prepared to protect us and our rights. And, I grew up with a family where I was an NRA Junior Eagle. We spent a lot of time on the gun range and doing sort of typical things that you would expect in the Intermountain West. And I felt really strongly that, like, my sovereignty and, my rights were tied up in the idea that the government could not, control me. Mm-hmm. And also in that demonstration, there were some faith leaders who wanted to be in conversation. And I was so eager to be in conversation with them. And I think that was atypical, but I think the way that you can see the advocacy of Wyoming Equality is that we're very engaged in faith work, right? Like, folks who perceive people as opposition or, not traditionally like aligned, we sort of reject that view and say, in Wyoming, we're all neighbors. In Wyoming, we have this opportunity to be in real conversation with each other. And we're always going to take that opportunity. And we're going to claim, what's ours. We're going to claim the protection of the Wyoming Constitution. And we're going to claim this welcome if this faith extends it.
I was just thinking, Sarah, so state legislator, I mean, did you, it seems like a natural now that you have told this story of your transition to become a state legislator as well. That spark maybe from when you were in high school, did that also lead you there as well?
Yeah, absolutely, it did. And I think that one of the things that is the most helpful about being an unexpected or a surprising ally is that um, people have beliefs or opinions of like what you believe or how you're going to be before they've ever met you. And I, heard from so many folks who are now very dear, very close friends of mine, who are in the opposition party, right? Who thought that like, oh man, like when Sarah shows up, like she's just going to be dropping bombs and, this extremist. And it was shocking to them that I'm so compelled to, find the places like Senator Enzi used to say, find those places where you do agree and build from there. And that's really what motivates me. And I mean, I find those associations so thrilling as well, and they're so meaningful, and they're not, transactional like a lot of politics are. Like they're purely relational. Like we'll vote against each other. We're not going to end up, voting the same. But man, do we love and respect each other. I always feel like Wyoming could be the place that shows other people how to do it. And I'm just afraid that like we don't recognize that, it's a muscle that you have to work. It's not on autopilot. It won't just happen, that people will have to keep ponying up for it.
I wonder how that would transfer into responsibly updating historical narratives. What do you think? How can we make sure that institutions or authors or other historians, even news journalists, are respectfully and responsibly being inclusive?
I mean, I think about the ways that we can be responsible to the historical record, takes some heavy lifting on sort of both sides of the polls. And I think on my side, right, like on the left, we have become intolerably fragile, right? Like there has been, so much conversation around the naming of historical, facts. Like just the naming of them is in itself a sort of violence that we need to be protected from. And I think that that is wrongheaded. And that if you look at the history of LGBTQ people in America, we're very resilient, we're very tough. And the naming of something as a reality cannot be a harm done against us. And then on the other side, on the right, I think that there is this clinging to old harms and sort of, whitewashing them as though, well, hey, it's history. There's nothing to do but celebrate it. Like, no, stop celebrating bad things. Put them in their appropriate sphere, name it. And again, like why I think Wyoming has the possibility to be a leader in this is that traditionally we have named hard things. We have stood by each other. Wyoming Equality has the golden rule of the snow ditch. And we say, do unto others in the snow ditch as you would have done unto you in the snow ditch. Because I've driven a Prius in the winter in Wyoming, which is a really terrible idea. And you will end up in a snow ditch. And you just have to trust that the person who's going to pull you out doesn't care who you voted for. They don't care who you want to go home and smooch or what your knickers look like. Like it would never occur to us to ask those things. We would just know that you were a neighbor and that you needed to help. And so we would help you.
My husband and I were just talking about that just the other day because he had two snow ditch experiences where he got pulled out and he pulled somebody else out. So we were just having that talk. And it's true. Yeah, that's why I love Wyoming for that.
Yeah, but it won't just happen because it was our history, And I mean, it has been our history. I mean, the thing that we are always educating people outside of Wyoming. And, we're the only red state in America who defeated every single anti-LGBTQ bill for 45 straight years. Right? Like, and it wasn't because there were people who were really animated by the humanity and dignity of LGBTQ people necessarily. And sometimes they were, but honestly, it was just we had a different idea of the role of government. And we didn't believe that the government existed to take away anybody's rights. We wanted more rights, not less. And I think that there are organizations right now who feel like, well, that's not good enough. Like, I need you to do it for the right reasons. And to me, having a belief that the government doesn't exist to limit your rights, that's the right reason. That's a great reason. Why are we dismissing that? Like, that's something, again, that like Wyoming could share with the rest of the country because it's been true for us. It wasn't just empty. It wasn't just, a slogan. Like, we put meat on the bones. Like, we defeated those bills for 45 straight years in the most conservative state in America.
And what you're saying now is only just a sliver of what you said is potentially going to happen with not only you in the leader seat, but also who comes next, being inspired by what you're doing, by being inspired by your words and the passion that you put behind them. But sometimes the things that we're doing now are minor in comparison to what could happen next. And I'm excited to see what happens next. But in your opinion, what do you hope becomes your legacy? What is that footprint that you want to leave for the next person?
Yeah, that's a great question. I hope that we just really build this idea of, a Wyoming that welcomes everyone. And I hope that people see themselves in it and feel like that's their birthright, And advocacy and, LGBTQ advocacy, I think there's been a struggle in the last, decade or so. All movements have this, right? Where you sort of cannibalize the folks who came before you, and then you're cannibalized in your turn. And then, it's hard to build power and momentum when that's your form of advocacy. And honestly, the only sort of off ramp I see to that is really grounded in listening to and learning from Indigenous communities. Indigenous communities are just starkly different in terms of seeing your movement and your leadership as part of a cycle, and really honoring, the people who came before and having a place for them. They're not cannibalized, right? Like, they're respected. And the new young people coming up, they're not dismissed, like, they're respected. And that comes when you have sort of a holistic communal belief in that cycle. And again, it's like everything. It won't just happen. It's not on autopilot. Like, you really have to invest in that. You have to invest in the people coming up, and you have to show them that, their voice is going to be listened to.
What, Sara, are some of the more like impactful, memorable events or stories that come to mind that you've witnessed or participated in as far as your advocacy work goes?
I'm thinking of there's this large picture that we had blown up from the state archives, and he was a Black miner in Sweetwater County. And I think the picture was taken in about 1911. So it's likely that he was one of those miners who was shipped out to break a strike and then refused to cross the picket line. His name was Larry Bill Williams. And in the picture, he's standing, by a mine in Sweetwater County. He's got his hand on his hip. He's real sassy. And he just feels like this living embodiment of, like, I don't know what his gender identity or his sexual orientation is. I don't know any of that. I know he has more swagger in this one picture than like the rest of the state. And he's just like bringing it, and he has this reputation of like, oh, Wyoming's always been white, Wyoming's always been, this way. And you're like, well, there's Larry Bill Williams telling you it's not true. And we had a young woman who is Black and trans, and she is 5th generation Wyoming. and she was visiting the office, and she stood in front of she stood in front of this picture of Larry Bill Williams, who she'd never seen before, and she put her hand on her hip, and I videoed her, and she just started channeling him. And like, it'll make me cry, like, thinking about it, because it felt just like, that's her ancestor, right? Like from 1911 Wyoming. And here she is, a young Black trans girl who's fifth generation, and she feels his story. She feels it. And yeah, I thought that was really beautiful. Yeah, so getting to know Sissy and Vicki Goodwin, both before Sissy kind of came to national prominence, and after. I think what brought him to national prominence, right, was that someone took a picture of him by the Vietnam War Memorial in Washington, D.C., because Sissy was a Vietnam veteran and a bull rider and a native Wyomingite, and an old-fashioned cross-dresser. And they thought it was a striking sort of image, this Wyoming cowboy who wore these petticoat dresses and had served his country so faithfully, and then had been treated so unkindly by that same country, by citizens who beat him and mocked him and kicked his teeth in and broke his ribs and arrested him on numerous occasions for being a man who preferred to wear women's clothing. And I always call Sissy like our cowboy bodhisattva because he's so kind and so generous and so just like overflowing with love, but not like in a fake way. Like he's still real. He's still real dirt road. He's still real, oil patch as well.
And Sara, someone who's listening to this interview I know I'm super inspired. What would you recommend someone who really wants to enact the kind of change that you're talking about, especially here in Wyoming? Where do they go? What's their first step?
So, for folks who are wanting to get involved, I think there's so much great leadership that's happening in rural Wyoming. There are so many like grandmas and aunties and people who, I get introduced to as I go around the state, and like the leadership is there, right? So, I think tapping into that so that you don't have to recreate the wheel. And, I can't say enough about the Wyoming State Archives and, our community library. Wyoming has these passionate, educated, skilled librarians. As a community, that's something we really have to invest in, because these people, they're your gateway. They're the people who have so much knowledge, and they're just waiting to share it with you.
Yay archives.
Wow, Sara, this has been an incredible interview. I'm delighted to have met you. I'm honored to have met you and spoken with you, and I'm sure that Leslie feels the same way. But that's all the time that we have for today's interview. We know that there's so much more to be learned, and so we're going to include links and other information with this video so that our viewers can take another step, either forward or looking back to the past. So please take a look for those.
Thank you so much, Leslie. It's always lovely to see you. And thank you so much, Janelle.